Hi, my name is Elizabeth Milroy, and I'm an emeritus professor of art and art history from Drexel University. I'm also a member of the Board of Counselors here at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and I was on the editorial committee as well as being a contributing author to our new book, 200 Years, which was published to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And today I want to talk about our graphics collection. The Historical Society has one of the largest graphics collections, actually even beyond the city of Philadelphia. If we think of prints, drawings, watercolors, photographs, and here you'll see some of the boxes that contain some of the photographs in our collection. And what I wanted to do today was to talk about some of the objects that I wrote about for our 200th anniversary book, beginning with what you might consider the seminal document in Philadelphia's history, because I want to show how these particular graphics can show us changes and developments in the city of Philadelphia over time. And of course, we always begin with William Penn's plan for the city of Philadelphia, which he developed with a man named Thomas Home, who was his chief surveyor here in Philadelphia. This was published in London in 1683 as a kind of real estate venture. Come over to Pennsylvania and buy land here in Philadelphia. And so it's an early example of, if you will, a real estate advertisement, Zillow, if you will. A couple of things to point out. First of all, of course, we're dealing with what looks at first glance like a grid, but it's actually, if you look closely, it's kind of modular, built around these 4 squares here, each of which William Penn envisioned as a public park. That's why the trees are there, with what are now Market Street and Broad Street at the center of the plan. A couple of other things to point out, if we can back up a bit here. Of course, the city was going to sit between the Delaware River and the Schuylkill. You'll see Schuylkill misspelled here. The word Schuylkill, a lot of people think it's an indigenous word. It's actually Dutch, and it means hidden river, because the mouth of the Schuylkill was very difficult to see thanks to the forests and Tinicum Island that disguised the river when the Dutch sailed by down the Delaware. And another thing to notice about this map is that there's very little topography indicated. We all know that Philadelphia kind of has lots of hills and valleys and bluffs. We see some of the water courses that go through the city at that point, but it seems to be very flat, which of course was not the case. Another thing to keep in mind about this map is how slowly the city of Philadelphia developed. It took a long time for building to occur all the way over to the Schuylkill. For the first, really more than 100 years of Philadelphia's existence, most people lived along the Delaware because that's where trade was. That's where the ships came in, and that's where trade and commerce and most of the residential areas were on the eastern side of the river. So if we move ahead about 100 years to actually just after the turn of the 19th century to 1804, we can see what's happening in Philadelphia. This is a map by a man named Varley, who actually, when this map was published, was living in Baltimore. But you can see here, again, it's a kind of aspirational vision of what the city of Philadelphia might look like as it's developed, an early example of city planning, if you will. And what Varley did here was to show us what could happen if the city was extended across the Schuylkill River into West Philadelphia, what he calls Westville. At this point, this part of the state was called Blockley Township, because remember, until 1854, the city of Philadelphia consisted only of the 2 square miles between Vine Street on the north, South Street on the south, between the 2 rivers. So this again is really aspirational. But what's really fun to look at is Varley does a much better job of telling us about the topography around the city. We see the low-lying marshes along the Schuylkill River here, and also the very high bluffs and watercourses here north of the city, because of course we actually shift geological regions in Philadelphia. It's right at a line between the Piedmont and the Southern Plains. Another thing to look at are the the names of people who owned country estates and farms north and south of the city. Some of them are familiar. Warner, Pratt, there's Lemon Hill, Mr. Pratt's house, Bishop White's house. So a lot of Philadelphians, wealthier Philadelphians, could afford to maintain a house in town. You can see how built up the city was here along the Delaware by this time. But they also had summer houses or country houses. And in fact, sometimes they went out to the country house in the wintertime for sleighing parties and the like. Again, something to remember is that it really, until as late as 1806, the city of Philadelphia only went as far west as as Broad Street. This is still pretty much undeveloped, and you can see these are all just sort of fields and gardens. Mr. Varley has included the new waterworks at the public square. Philadelphia was really the first city to have a publicly administered water supply for its citizens in response to the yellow fever epidemics that had hit the city regularly over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. So here's Philadelphia building up slowly but surely. But again, an important thing to remember, until 1777, in fact, this was all forest. So when you look at these maps, take them with a grain of salt, because they're showing us what Philadelphia might become rather than what Philadelphia actually might have been at that time. Another quick note about Mr. Varley: he includes the library building, the new Bank of the United States. So some of the architectural monuments in the city should show that Philadelphia was a modern and growing city with important pieces of architecture. Another thing to keep in mind, and I think back to William Penn's plan, is that when Penn laid out Philadelphia, he was thinking about London. He was thinking about, how can I recreate the city of London in this new colony of Pennsylvania, in the New World. So Philadelphia is bustling, it's growing up. As I mentioned, in 1854, the county and the city of Philadelphia were consolidated for a number of reasons. Some of you who may have heard Richard Dilworth's talk on Monday night will have heard about it had to do with improving policing and fire prevention in the city. It also had to do with the tax base, because a lot of industry was developing around the city by the middle of the 19th century, and people in the center city wanted to grab hold of some of that income. You'll also notice that, what's happened to the public squares? Where have they gone? Well, it's disappearing. There it is. If we look really closely, there's what we now call Franklin Square, but Washington Square down here seems to have disappeared. Here's what would become Rittenhouse Square out in the west, and Logan Square here, still indicated. But even though these public squares had appeared on William Penn's map, and some people were aware of them in Penn's plan, the city didn't really pay a lot of attention to developing them in concert with Penn's image of the sort of the idea of public parks and public squares. And a good example of the city's kind of laid-back approach to these public squares is what happened during the Civil War to Logan Square. Here is a wonderful lithograph that was published in 1864 to commemorate what was known as the Great Central Sanitary Fair. You might not be able to see it very well, but here it is. This was a 200,000 square foot temporary collection of buildings, complex of buildings that were built by volunteer labor on Logan Square, at what was still then Logan Square before it became Logan Circle. And here you can see they're completely covered. And this was a fair that was organized by private citizens to raise money for medical services for the Union Army and Navy. And it was because the government, the federal government at that time, didn't really have an organized health service. They didn't really have the capacity to accommodate suddenly all of the men who had volunteered or who were drafted to serve in the military, because the standing army was pretty small at the beginning of the Civil War. And so money had to come in, and they relied on, literally, it was like a charity bazaar. If you walked into this central building, which was called Union Avenue, it was lined with booths, just like a church fair, a society or a charity bazaar, or an agricultural exhibition. And you could go in there and buy everything and anything, souvenirs. You could. There were restaurants. there were historical displays of objects like what was known as the Penn Parlor, to which the Historical Society of Pennsylvania loaned some important historical artifacts. It also included, here's the restaurant here with the wood roof, and matching it on the other side with the canvas roof was a horticultural display. And right alongside here, this was 500 feet long, it was an art gallery with over 1,000 works of paintings, drawings, photographs on view in what was the largest art exhibition in the country at that time. Now, what we notice too is that it shows us that the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul was already there, having been recently opened at Logan Square, the great Catholic cathedral. And so it gives us also a sense of the skyline of the city by 1864. So we're going to move ahead a little bit to 1876. The men and women who participated in organizing the sanitary fair, they got a lot of important experience from this. Many of the women had already worked organizing charity bazaars and the like in the past. And they were able to turn that experience to good use about 12 years later in 1876 when Philadelphia hosted the first true World's Fair in the United States, what we know as the Centennial Exhibition, which was in West Fairmount Park. It was organized to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And literally dozens and dozens of temporary buildings were built on the Lansdowne Plateau in West Fairmount Park. 2 of those buildings were permanent. One of them, that used to be known as Memorial Hall, is now the Please Touch Museum, so you can go and visit that and see what these buildings look like. They built massive exhibition buildings, one of which was called the Main Building. It was the largest building in the world at the time. It was the size of something like 3 football fields, one after the other. But in addition to these massive exhibition buildings were these tiny little sort of intimate jewel-like buildings, many of which were concessions where you could get soda water, soda pop, or candies. The Singer sewing machine had a display. Many manufacturers included them. And this is one of 2 buildings where they sold popcorn. And popcorn was a very popular snack, as you can imagine, then as now. This is a watercolor by a man named David Kennedy. He was a Scottish immigrant who arrived in Philadelphia and settled in about 1839. And he worked for the Reading Railroad for a time. He also worked for the Fairmount Park Commission. He was hired as a draftsman because he had already established a reputation as a very accomplished semi-professional watercolor painter. And he specialized in views of the city of Philadelphia. And he did these incredibly meticulous, detailed views of buildings around the city and kind of documenting the changing look of Philadelphia from roughly 1839 until 1880. So 40 years, 40 plus years that he was dedicated to making these views. And these are really important documents. And HSP has over 1,000 of these watercolors by Kennedy. You can see the amazing detail. What I found really interesting about Kennedy's watercolors is it shows us that the buildings at the Centennial were polychrome. They were different colors because a lot of the photographs from this time, of course, or all the photographs, are in black and white or in sepia tone. So you don't get that color polychrome. Kennedy's also helpful because each of his watercolors was accompanied by, he would include these very detailed captions underneath, sort of explaining what you're looking at. Sometimes he's painting it as it looked at the time he painted it. Sometimes he does kind of reminiscences of what a certain part of the city may have looked like 20 years before. And here you see he's signed it in the watercolor itself. And he then pasted all these watercolors, and he seems to have assembled a collection of albums, kind of documenting his life work. And that's what HSP was able to acquire. We think we acquired most of them from his daughter. I'm doing research on Kennedy right now, just trying to figure out exactly where all of these came from, because they were a wonderful, wonderful resource. And an amazing resource for tracking Philadelphia's history. I'm going to turn back here and pick up another example of a Kennedy. Here you can see This is a watercolor that he did in 1864, so the same year as the Great Central Sanitary Fair. David Kennedy was roaming the streets of Philadelphia, setting up his easel. He probably used a kind of viewing device, like a pantograph or something similar, that he could set up a kind of lens, sort of like a camera without film, but you'd look through this and it would project a view of the buildings that you're drawing, and he could then sketch and trace the outlines, and then would go back home and fill them in with watercolor. He's very precise when it comes to the buildings, but his imagination takes hold when he starts painting trees, and his skies are terrific. I love his skies. So here we are looking at, as he tells us, the southwest corner of Broad and Spruce Street. So here's Broad Street right in front of us, and Spruce Street heading out to the west, as you can see, lined with fairly substantial townhouses. This was upper middle class neighborhood in the city at this point in 1864, but also not heavily or densely settled at this point by any means. One of the amazing things about the Historical Society's collections is that you can come in looking for one particular document, one particular image, one particular object, and then that can lead you to find something else you hadn't expected to find, to learn something new as a result of, say, looking at this particular watercolor and saying, gee, I wonder what else HSP can tell me about what the corner of Broad and Spruce Street looked like over time and how it has changed over time. And so I find that coming to HSP it's like a marvelous detective story. I'm always finding new things that I hadn't expected, and it makes you sort of sit back and scratch your head and rethink what, okay, what is this history that I'm telling? So, for example, learning that David Kennedy worked for the Park Commission, and if anyone's interested in the history of what used to be in East and West Fairmount Park, for example, you can come and look at Kennedy's watercolors, and he made all of these watercolors of some of the inns, the taverns, and the factories that were in East and West Fairmount Park before they were torn down by the Park Commission. And Kennedy is only one of many, many artists who did these kinds of views in the city in the 18th century, or in the 19th century. And so there's a lot to choose from, a lot to go through. Sometimes it can be a little overwhelming. So in answer to that question about, okay, well, what did the corner of Broad and Spruce Street look like over time? I went to something called the Boys Penrose collection of photographs. And here is the corner of basically Broad and Locust, so just the next block north, in about 1904, photographed by an unidentified photographer. We're looking north towards the brand new City Hall, which had only recently been completed. It took 30 years to build City Hall. There's William Penn looking up to the northeast from the top of the tower of City Hall. And you can see, just if you compare the two images, just how Broad Street has changed really in the 50 years that, or even 40 years that separates these two images. You can pull back and show us the two together. That would be great. But you have to look closely at all of these images, because that's the trick of working with images, is don't just take it at first glance, because if you look really carefully, you will see something else in this photograph that tells you a lot about the history of Philadelphia. And here we have a man with a boater walking by, and horses and carriages, but can we all see the sheep? These are sheep being driven to market. Sheep and cattle were still being driven into Center City, Philadelphia, to the Reading Terminal, to the Italian market, as late as the 1920s. If you were people who grew up along Lancaster Avenue, remember livestock being driven from Lancaster County, Montgomery County, coming into the city to market. So imagine, if you think it's difficult, navigating around pedestrians and cars nowadays, imagine adding sheep to the mix. So these are just some of the amazing graphic objects that we have at HSP that can provide amazing insights into Philadelphia's history, and actually the history of other cities and communities around the state of Pennsylvania and beyond. I'm thinking if there are questions, I'm happy to answer any questions that might be popping up in the chat. so we don't have any chats yet. Let's go back to Mr. Varley's map, and what also connects the Varley map and the Great Central Sanitary Fair is that is the history of Philadelphia's park system. So William Penn laid out 4 public squares. The 5th public square was Center Square, and that was supposed to be where government buildings would be built, maybe a meeting house. But by the early part of the 19th century, when the squares were named, Franklin, Washington, Penn, Rittenhouse, and Logan, it also became apparent as the city was expanding and expanding quickly that there would be need for a larger park. And beginning in the 1840s, there was a movement in the city to actually expand the city's park. And thanks to the Consolidation Act in 1854, the city was able to move in and expropriate land along the banks of the Schuylkill River. And there were 2 motives, 2 reasons motivating the acquisition of this land. One was because the Schuylkill River was the source of Philadelphia's water supply. It is still the source of Philadelphia's water supply to a great extent. And so they thought that by making this parkland, they would protect the banks of the river from industry. Didn't quite work that way because, of course, the industry just moved upriver to Norristown and Conshohocken and was still pumping things into the river, but it seemed to make sense in the 1850s and 60s. The second reason was because there was a real concern among many Philadelphians to preserve the landscapes here, these estate landscapes that had been set up by people like the Penn family, the Peters family, Henry Pratt's Lemon Hill, which is right here, that still stands there. And that these were important historical landscapes associated with the history of the early republic and the creation of the United States of America. And that, again, expropriating this land, removing all of the industrial landscape, the industrial architecture that had been added over the decades, that these could be preserved. And that's why, unlike New York, that when they created Central Park in New York, they came in and completely reconfigured the topography of central Manhattan. In Philadelphia, they tried to preserve as much of the topography of the east and west parks along the Schuylkill, as well as the Wissahickon. We had the Wissahickon, which was already a famous kind of wilderness, wild, picturesque landscape, and that was added to the collection of parks, if you will, that we used to know as the Fairmount Park System, is now known as the System of Parks and Philadelphia Parks and Recreation. And so the history of the acquisition of parks is motivated by a desire to preserve these historic places. Similarly with Logan Square, after the Great Central Sanitary Fair, we moved back to see the lithograph again. Some people responded to this and said, well, wait a minute, we shouldn't be just building over Logan Square. This is one of William Penn's original squares. And so it was turned into a circle when the Benjamin Franklin Parkway was constructed at the beginning of the 20th century. But part of this move was really to appreciate and preserve the spaces that William Penn had designated as public parks. I should mention that the Great Central Sanitary Fair lasted for a little bit over 2 weeks. 25,000 people a day visited the fair. It raised about $1 million in funds for the medical services, and then everything was torn down. Much of the timber and the iron that was used for the construction was acquired by the Pennsylvania Railroad, who was building train stations at that point. So this is completely temporary, but as you can see, like the Popcorn Building here at the Centennial, a temporary building, in this case, that was standing for about 9 months over the course of 1876. The exhibition opened in May, it closed in December, and then these buildings, many of them were torn down and salvaged. Some were sold. There are Centennial buildings that now serve as train stations and churches in various places in New Jersey and the like. So tracking the history of these buildings is also a really fun detective project.
So we do have some questions for you, Lily. The first question, wait, really quick, asks what hotel was in the photo of Broad and Locust.
Well, we're looking at the Bellevue Stratford here, or the Fairmount. I am not sure what this is.
Great. And is it true that Logan Square was used for public hangings?
Yes.
And
yes.
when?
In the early part of the 19th century, the late 18th, early 19th century.
Great. Someone else asks, when did house and street numbers come into existence in Philadelphia, and how has that changed over time, and do the maps show that change?
Actually, not these particular maps. That's a really, really good question, because at the time that Mr. Varley made this map in the early 19th century, streets were numbered going from the rivers inside. So this would have been Front Street, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and then these streets were known as Schuylkill 1st, Schuylkill 2nd, Schuylkill 3rd, and you can see that if you look, you'll see it's front, 2nd, 3rd. So the word Schuylkill was in front. The numbering was a bit random. Also notice that north of Penn's Plan, the streets go off in all different directions. So here we have Ridge Road, also known as the Wissahickon Road, and there's the Germantown Road. They didn't pay any attention to the idea of a grid. The numbering system came in after consolidation in 1854, and that's when the numbering system was regularized, so it became front, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, all the way out to 69th Street in the west.
I think the Frankfurt Historical Society is on our call. Thank you for joining. Can we identify Frankfurt on this map, maybe?
Over here.
Wow. So along the Delaware.
Yeah. Notice Globe Mills. It's already there by. I should notice too that the Varley actually copied other maps when he made this map. So a lot of it's coming out of his imagination. So you can't, for example, trust the boundaries of these various estates. They were not nice, regular little parallelograms as he's indicated.
Can you talk about the number of the editions of this map?
That is something that I didn't look up beforehand. He actually had done an earlier map in 1796 that didn't include the extension into Westville or West Philadelphia, as we know. And this was in 1804. And of course, they would pull as many copies as possible. One of the reasons we think that he included people's names up here with their estates was in an effort to attract subscribers to pay for the cost of making the map.
And what about the home map from earlier?
So the home map, we know that there are at least 2 editions. The home map it's actually something that those of us here at HSP are going to look at and try and determine just what we have in the collection, because we have many copies of the home map, and we know we also have the copper plate for the home map, which shows that it was actually burnished and adjusted later in its history, so that one of the things about having a copper plate of engraving is that you can keep pulling impressions for as long as the engraving survives. It begins to flatten out after a while. But we know, for example, that at the beginning of the 19th century, a man named Thomas Cope, who was the chair of the watering committee, who was very concerned about what was happening to Penn Squares, actually made arrangements to have more impressions pulled from the portraiture and distributed them to fellow members of City Council in an effort to advocate for preserving Penn Squares and thinking about the development of parks in the city.
So moving forward a little bit, someone asks, was there a connection to the art gallery at the Sanitary Fair and the one at the Centennial, which led to the founding of PMA?
Totally. Yes. In fact, many of the same people, Joseph Harrison, who was an important collector in town, was the chairman of the Fine Arts Committee for the Sanitary Fair exhibition. And it directly leads to the organization. Another man who was involved with both exhibitions was John Sartain, who was an important printmaker and publisher in town. And Sartain would be the chair of the Fine Arts Committee for the Centennial in 1876. Memorial Hall was built as a permanent building in order to become the home of the new Pennsylvania School and Museum of Industrial Art, and which moved in 1877. That was the original name of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So there's a direct genealogical connection, and HSP is as a major repository of materials on genealogy, not just the genealogy of people, but the genealogy of buildings and spaces. And that's a wonderful question. Thank you so much, because this is a wonderful example of how documents and images in the HSP collections can provide you with a kind of architectural genealogy or urban genealogy of a city like Philadelphia.
Great. We have some other orgs on the call. We have the King of Prussia Historical Society, the Tri-County Heritage Library.
Hi,
yes, so hi everybody. And the photo looking north on Broad, shouldn't the Union League Club building be there?
Yes, and you have to look really closely. It's kind of hidden back here.
There it is. Right. At the time the map was made, so I think they're referencing the Varley map, where was the most expensive or exclusive place to purchase and or live in the city?
That's an interesting question, and it presupposes that people at certain economic levels lived in different areas. So if you were a poor person, you lived here, and if you were a rich person, you lived there. That was actually not the case in the 18th century. There was much more intermixing of people of various economic levels. So for example, the Cadwalladers and other families were, still in their houses. They're beginning to move out, but in the 18th century, certainly there's a lot of mixing of economic levels, and part of that is indicated by the construction of these little alleyways. So one of the things that happened in the course of the 18th century, because everyone was clustering along the Delaware, is that they built these little alleyways, and so oftentimes there would be a large townhouse, and then the supporting houses that might be lived in by enslaved people as well as free people would be built in these alleyways. By the 1850s, Rittenhouse Square has become a kind of exclusive area, but it's right beside an area that was, if you will, much poorer. And so Joseph Harrison, our friend who was involved with the art gallery at the Sanitary Fair, built a big house on Rittenhouse Square and actually had a public art gallery that he invited members of the public to join or to visit, rather, on a regular basis. And so another thing that's important to keep in mind about Philadelphia is this sort of juxtaposition and infiltration, if you will, of multiple, different kinds of people. Of course, by the beginning of the 20th century, the Seventh Ward here, which is written about by W.B. Du Bois, is located right along here. So this was an important African-American neighborhood that had developed. So it's a city that is moving and changing just as much throughout its history as it has been more recently.
Great. Lots of friends on the call. Hello to Harrington House and Carpenter's Hall who are joining us today. I think someone from Stenton was here earlier. Speaking of historic Germantown, someone asks, was the home map at HSP made from the same plate as the one at Cliveden?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that.
Great.
We'll have to look at the two plates.
See if they align.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, we've got lots of great comments coming in. If anyone has any questions before we wrap up our live today, let Lily know. We are happy to have you with us. All right.
So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you again on Facebook sometime in the future. And please don't forget our 200th birthday, which highlights 100 objects from HSP's collections with extensive commentaries by, I think, 58 different authors. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. So please come to HSP, become a member, come and really revel in the riches that you can find in this incomparable collection. Thank you so much, everyone. TGIF. And Merry Christmas.